Hi, everybody. Mr. Gibson here. Apologies for the technical difficulties with the live stream. As a result, as I mentioned in class today, what we're going to do is we're going to reduce the number of multiple choice questions from 25 to 15 as an acknowledgement of that particular mistake on my part. So, what you have in front of you that's not blacked out are the terms that you need to be familiar with for the multiple choice portion of the exam. So we're going to go ahead and start with the terms, and then we'll move our way to the learning objectives. Starting out, we have the Radical Republicans. This is a wing of the Republican Party during the 1860s, primarily during the Civil War and Reconstruction period. Radical Republicans are abolitionists. They favor punishment of the South after the Civil War. They want to do everything in their power to protect the newly given rights to African American citizens in the South. And they also are firm believers in making sure there is a strong federal presence of troops in the South to make sure that the new laws that are being handed down from the federal level are being followed by the Southerners. Now, we know, and we've talked about in terms of plans for Reconstruction, there are several. Military Reconstruction is the one plan that did come through. Abraham Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was known as the 10% plan. It was developed as early as mid 1863, and it called for a very forgiving plan for bringing the states in rebellion back into the Union. It only required 10% of the southern states' population to take a loyalty oath, and then they would be brought back into the Union after the war. It was seen as a very forgiving plan. Lincoln, as he mentioned in his second inaugural, he didn't want, with malice towards none, he wanted to make sure that the South knew that we had to move on from this brutal conflict. Now, obviously, Lincoln's Reconstruction plan was not very popular within his own party, specifically with the radical Republican wing. And unfortunately, as a result of his assassination, the plan never went through, and instead military Reconstruction did, where the South was turned into military districts, where federal troops were stationed for a period of over 10 years in the South, basically enforcing the new laws and trying to protect the freed slaves who were still choosing to live in the South. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, and you need to know what these are, not just for this test, but for the APUSH test. These are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. Simply put, the 13th Amendment ends slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment is what we call birthright citizenship. It establishes the fact that if you are born in the United States, you are indeed a citizen. And the 15th Amendment is the first voting rights amendment for minorities in the United States. It called for extending voting rights to African American men. Now, obviously, women still, in the late 1860s, still do not have the right to the vote. But this is the second major expansion of access to voting or voting rights in American history. So those are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Scallywags and carpetbaggers, these are terms that apply to the Reconstruction period. Scallywags are Southerners who supported the North or the Union or were themselves Republicans. Carpetbaggers, these were profiteers that came from the North to take advantage of the South's misfortune. And there was a group of Southerners that later became known as the Redeemers. And what they were attempting to do was try and return the South's social order to how it was at the beginning of the Civil War. And one of the tools that they used for that was the terrorist organization known as the Ku Klux Klan. Their primary goal was to intimidate not only the white population who was supporting Reconstruction, who was supporting the Union, who was supporting the Republican Party, but also to intimidate the newly freed slaves, to make sure that they maintain that social order, that social caste system that was set up in the South. We all know that the first version of the Southern Ku Klux Klan was crushed when President Grant came into office within a couple of months. But we need to know that this terrorist organization, its primary goal was to try and limit the newfound rights of African Americans in the South after the Civil War. Now, the election of 1876, the one thing you need to understand about it is that it was an election that was very close between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes. It was so close, in fact, that the election had to go to Congress. They had to set up a special commission for it because the vote was so close, and because many of the southern states were still military districts, and they weren't exactly sure how to navigate the voting rights, or how they were going to count the electoral votes of those military districts. And so, as a result of that close election, we have the Compromise of 1877, which happens the year later. Uh, Essentially, this was a deal that was struck between the Democrats and the Republicans. Now, remember, Democrats in the 1860s, primarily Southerners, Republicans in the 1860s, primarily Northerners. And the deal that was struck was Rutherford B. Hayes, who was the Republican candidate, he was able to ascend the presidency. But in exchange for that, what the Democrats got is the removal of all federal troops from the South. When this happened, we know that this signaled the end of the Reconstruction period in the South. And unfortunately, with no federal troops there to enforce the law, much of the South reverted to exactly how it was prior to the Civil War, where African Americans living in the South were slaves in all but name. So the Compromise of 1877 is what ended Reconstruction. One of the things that was set up by the Redeemers during Reconstruction are specific laws that were meant to target the newly freed African American population. These are known as black codes. These are laws that were violating these Americans' First Amendment, Second, and basically constitutional rights. They were state laws that were struck down during Reconstruction, but nonetheless they were put out there. And what we see happen after Reconstruction is that idea of setting up specific laws to limit the rights of African Americans continued in the South. And that's when the South goes into its segregationist period, where instead of black codes, you have now what are called Jim Crow laws. And we'll be talking about those as we move forward in the civil rights movement. So that's what black codes are. The Freedmen's Bureau, this was a federal organization that was set up in the South. As many of you called for in your own Reconstruction plans, there had to be some type of organization to provide job training, to provide education, or to provide essentially transitional help to slaves who were now free. The problem with the Freedmen's Bureau is that it was not fully funded, and there weren't enough of the agents or the offices set up to really help all of those African Americans who were now free. The Wade-Davis bill, this is the opposite of Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. It is a severely punitive Reconstruction plan. This was sponsored by many radical Republicans. They were looking for a 50% ironclad loyalty oath before Southern states were readmitted into the Union. We also know that the Wade-Davis bill called for very harsh measures against Confederate leadership. But just like Lincoln's plan, the Wade-Davis bill never came to fruition, and it was military Reconstruction that ended up winning the day. Sharecropping is the primary job or the primary occupation of most freed slaves in the South. With little or no education and with really only knowing how to farm crops, sharecropping became a method of keeping African Americans in a constant state of poverty. They would, in many cases, rent the land from their former masters to farm their crops, and whatever profits they made in terms of selling those crops, they had to give a portion away to the folks that own those lands. So sharecropping, why it stands out is because it ends up being a tool for keeping African Americans in poverty, and therefore at the lower end of, I should say, the bottom end of Southern society through the rest of the 19th century, all the way up through the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. Okay, so now we're going to shift to Chapter 17. These are the terms that you need to know. Everything I said prior was all from Chapter 16 in Reconstruction. The Dawes Act, essentially what the Dawes Act did is it meant that the United States would no longer recognize Native American tribes and instead would recognize Native Americans as individual landowners. And remember, we talked about the clash of cultures that happened on the Great Plains. This is another example. Land ownership is not seen as a singular person's occupation. In other words, whereas the European settlers felt that one person could own a very large chunk of land, typically most Native American tribes believed in communal ownership. And what the Dawes Act did is it ended communal ownership, at least legally, and it also solidified the Indian reservation system that was set up to where Native Americans from all sorts of tribes were basically taken from their ancestral land and placed on what are now known as Indian reservations. The Battle of Little Bighorn, 1876, the longest war that the United States ever fought was during this period of westward expansion. It's also known as the Indian Wars. The Battle of Little Bighorn stands out because it was the largest Native American force that was ever assembled again to resist not only white settlement but also the United States cavalry. And they wiped out the 7th Cavalry that was commanded by George Armstrong Custer. And why this is significant is it's one of the few major victories that the Native Americans had against the United States Cavalry and against white settlement. And remember, like, when we looked at the map and saw how there were battles all over the place in the Great Plains and there were massacres on both sides, this is a very brutal war that was fought over a 40-year period. So the Battle of Little Bighorn stands out as one of the few times that the Native American tribes were able to form a cohesive alliance to try and resist white settlement, to try and push it back. Another form of resistance of the changes that were happening in the daily life of many Native Americans on the Great Plains was the ghost dance movement. This was started by a Paiute Native American, and essentially what the ghost dance was seen by Native Americans, it was seen as a way to try and reclaim the lives and the way of life that they had enjoyed prior to the push of European settlement into the West. And again, the clash of cultures. Many members of the United States government saw the ghost dance movement as a threat, as a open protest against what had happened in the West. And indeed it was. It was seen as a way to try and give people in a very hopeless situation a sense of hope. So that's what the ghost dance movement is. The massacre at Wounded Knee, it is the event in 1890 in December that many historians consider the ending of westward expansion. It is the very unfortunate massacre of close to 300 Native Americans, Minneconchu Sioux, at the hands of the United States Cavalry. And there were people killed on both sides during the fight that ensued. But it is seen as kind of the ending point of Western expansion, and that's what you need to remember about Wounded Knee. Obviously, the fact it was a tragedy, too, of course. Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis. Remember, this is the guy that is arguing that the American character is one that has been shaped by westward expansion. So ever since we landed as English settlers, all the way up until this point, the push west and the expanding of land in the West, and then obviously settling that land, Frederick Jackson Turner is arguing is the thing that really created what an American is. And then all of this was facilitated by the Transcontinental Railroad, which was completed in 1869, 4 years after the Civil War had finished. And the railroad basically guaranteed a couple things. It guaranteed the West was going to be settled quickly. It guaranteed Native American life was going to be utterly changed forever. And it also ushered in and provided the very important network in terms of transportation that's going to fuel the Industrial Revolution in the United States. And we'll be talking about that when you guys get back from winter break. And then lastly, the Plains Native Americans, we know they're very diverse. There's several hundred tribes there, different languages. Again, some of them traded with each other, some of them didn't. But you have to understand that they were centered around two animals, the horse. Most of these tribes were nomadic, and then the buffalo, which was their primary food source. And it was a combination of the Transcontinental Railroad and the near extinction of the buffalo that almost ended Native American life in North America. So those are the kind of key things that you need to understand in terms of the terms for the, in terms of the terms? Yeah, we'll go with that. For the multiple choice section of the test. Now, some of the learning objectives that are going to be covered, the economic causes and effects of the settlement of the West. Well, first off, you need to know that the railroads really acted as a hub for economic development. We talked about how, in today's world, freeways tend to be magnets for development. Well, railroads were that same type of magnet. Many towns and cities in the West were built up around the railroads because um, of the fact that so many people were traveling on it, and because it brought up people very quickly and in large numbers. So, in terms of the economic piece that you have to know about the settlement of the West, that's the main one. Yes, the land was cheap. Yes, there were gold and silver strikes that acted as pull factors to bringing people over into the West. But in large part, all of this was basically facilitated by the railroad. And that's what you need to understand there. In terms of the social causes and effects of the westward settlement, well, we know that obviously, as a result of Western settlement, we see the near destruction of Native American culture in North America. We also see how many Native Americans have chose to assimilate to white culture. Many of them are placed on reservation and taken away from their ancestral lands. We also know that the West itself is becoming a very, very diverse place. We'll be talking about immigration into the United States during the 19th century when you guys return from winter break as well. But the main thing you have to understand is that, the big change in terms of society is the clash of cultures that happens on the Great Plains. Explain the effects of government policy during Reconstruction on society. I mean, essentially, the military and the federal government was able to enforce the new laws, whether it be the new amendments to the Constitution or the new laws that were set forth for protecting the rights of African Americans. They were able to do so because the Army was there. And during Reconstruction, what we see large numbers of black men voting for the first time. We see large numbers of black men who are serving in the state house legislatures. They're serving in Congress, even some of them as senators and governors. So what we see during Reconstruction is we see an expansion of voting rights. But unfortunately, what's going to happen is as soon as the Army is taken out of there and there's no one there to protect those now freed African American citizens, the South is going to do everything it can to try and limit the rights of those individuals. And then lastly, explain how and why Reconstruction resulted in continuity and change in regional and national understandings of what it meant to be an American. Well, we do know that the Civil War certainly forged the United States into a country. People looked at themselves as Americans first rather than, I'm a New Yorker or I'm a Tennessean, that type of thing. One obvious significant change that we see is the expansion of voting rights, as I mentioned, but we also see the continuity of the fact that African Americans still have a very long way to go in terms of reaching equal social status, equal political status, equal economic status in the United States. So those are the main things you need to understand for the multiple choice. So I hope this helps. May the force be with you, everybody, and good luck on our last test of the first semester. All right. See everyone soon. Bye.